Welcome. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see you. Thank you for being here for City Club's forum on the fate of Idaho's public lands. I understand folks are still getting food, but we wanted to start as early as we could because we've got a fantastic group of panelists. We've got a lot to cover, and that's why I'm starting just a couple of minutes early. If the panelists, when they get a chance, can come join me on stage, that would be fantastic. If you still have your meal, bring it as well. But again, welcome to this City Club Forum. My name is McKay Cunningham. I'm a professor at the College of Idaho. I'm the director of the College of Idaho's new MAP program, Master of Applied Public Policy, and also a co-chair of the planning committee here for City Club. We begin by acknowledging the ancestral, cultural, traditional, and unceded territory of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Northern Paiute people on which we are meeting today. City Club of Boise is a nonpartisan nonprofit that brings people together for community conversations about local, state, and national issues that matter, because things happen when we have conversations about them. Thanks to all of our current members and individual donors. If you are not a member of City Club of Boise, please consider joining us. On your tables, there's a little pamphlet and it has a QR code. Go ahead and check that out if you are interested in becoming a member. And you can become a member for 50% discount if you do so in the next 24 hours. I'd like to recognize our sponsors next. And if you could please hold your applause till the end, that would be fantastic. Our annual sponsors are the University of Idaho, Boise State University Public School of Service, the City of Boise, and the Idaho Humanities Council. Our 2025 Forum Series sponsors are AARP, Albertsons, Hawley Troxel, Idaho Education Association, Micron, Select Health, Small Mine Development, and St. Luke's. City Clubs receives grant funding from the Idaho Humanities Council and the Idaho Community Foundation. Our community partner is the Osher Institute for Lifelong Learning at Boise State University. Boise State Public Radio is our principal media sponsor. Idaho Public Television is also a media sponsor. Thanks to our friends of City Club who give $2,500 or more to sustain our work. They include AJ and Susie Balukov, the Fry family, George and Bev Herod, Debbie Johnson and David Clopton, Skip and Esther Oppenheimer, Darwin and Char Roy, Peg Doitery, Sydney and Clark Fiddler. Idaho Fish and Wildlife Foundation is sponsoring today's forum. And finally, thank you to the organizations sponsoring tables today. Now the applause. Today's moderator is Jack Cafferty, the VP for College Relations at the College of Idaho and former Center Director at the Peregrine Fund. Jack will introduce the panelists and we'll get underway.
Thanks, McKay. Give me 1 second. I just had a big birthday, so I get to put my glasses on now. Thanks for having me. Today's City Club Forum addresses a topic that's been near and dear to a lot of our hearts. It's been in the state and national news, and it's a topic that's controversial and been cited as a point of division for many of us in the room and many of us abroad. In order to make the most of our time, I'm not going to go through long resumes and introductions of our panelists, but we'll instead briefly introduce them with their titles, using some current titles, and I'll just sort of avoid all the long intros. And more importantly, with your permission, I'm going to refer to you by first name basis, mainly because, Brad, I cannot see myself calling you Mr. Brooks, okay?
That's fair.
So immediately to my left is Merrill Baylor, rancher, board member, Idaho Rangeland Resource Commission, and Idaho Business for the Outdoors, and former Republican legislator for District 8. Thanks for being here. Next to him is Alexis Pickering, Executive Director for the Conservation Voters for Idaho, and Brad Brooks, CEO of Argali. Again, thank you all for being here. So to kick things off right away, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to go ahead and briefly describe your background, expertise, experience, and particularly as it relates to Idaho's public lands. Meryl, let's start with you.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here today in Boise, Idaho. So you said expertise and all that?
Yeah.
All right. So I am a rancher. We have a ranch at the headwaters of the Lemhi River. It's both private lands and public lands. I got my education at Boise State and was in education. I spent 21 years in the classroom. But I guess my passion has always been for the land and the wild and the water, those kind of things. So basically, I've been the executive director not the executive director, chairman of the board for the Lemhi Regional Land Trust. We've accomplished about 15,000 acres that have been put in conservation easements. And I guess just working with the land and the water, and you've already mentioned some of the other things, so that's what I do.
Great, thank you. Alexis?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alexis Pickering. I grew up in Idaho County in Koosky. I was a wildland firefighter for 2 seasons, brushed Forest Service roads with my dad and his small business growing up, and had the backdrop of the Selway Bitterroot and the Clearwater National Forest as our proverbial backyard. Came down to Boise, traditionally have a background in public health, but understand the connection between getting outside, access to the outdoors through public lands as such an integral part of how a community thrives, right? And so now as the executive director for CVI, Conservation Voters for Idaho, we work to create the political environment that protects the natural environment. So naturally, public lands and protecting public lands are a huge part of that effort, and supporting folks through leadership development or education or electing conservation champions that support public land.
Great, thanks. Brad, what about you?
Grew up here in Meridian, Idaho, went to College of Idaho. I spent about 18 years working in the public lands conservation space for the Wilderness Society. I worked on everything from wilderness campaigns. I ran national campaigns for the Wilderness Society. And then at some point along the way, I started this company, Argali, that I now run. And we make and manufacture lightweight hunting gear and equipment, everything from tents, trekking poles, knives, sleeping bags, all sorts of stuff. And I'm an avid hunter, outdoorsman, spent my life recreating here in Idaho, and been fortunate to always do what I love in the state, which is both conservation and now where I'm at right now, running my company with focus on making gear that people use to enjoy the outdoors.
Great, thanks, Brad. So to kick things off, I'm going to bounce around just a little bit. I've got some individual questions and then obviously some questions that'll go for the whole panel. Alexis, let's start with you. What's the current status quo in terms of, can you identify for the audience what is entailed by public lands, and specifically here in Idaho, who owns public lands and who controls public lands?
Given the youngest one, the big history question, I like it. Well, and if I forget something, feel free to remind me.
Yeah.
So basically, public lands, the national public lands that we have that live within Idaho belong to all Americans, essentially, right? I think that's a thing that most folks that move here, and we've seen a huge influx of folks that have moved to Idaho, they don't understand the nuance between national public lands versus state lands. So I do want to make that clear distinction. State lands are managed for a very different purpose. It's to support institutions in our schools, and there's specific statutes around why and how they manage those lands in a very different perspective, right? Versus our national lands are generally managed for all users. So somewhat like what Brad was saying, for hunting, for fishing, some for logging, right? There's a lot of recreation. So naturally that can create some challenges because there's 2 different goals for how we manage those lands. And as part of what created Idaho's statehood, it's very clear in Idaho's constitution that we basically had to set aside 62% of our land to pay into and become a state as part of the union through the equal footing doctrine. So there's a really clear reason why we had to do that to help pay, not reparations, but pay for the cost of the Revolutionary War. Versus Eastern colonies, they had to pay a separate debt. So there's a real deep history and reason why we have so many public lands, so much public land. I think it's like I've heard 32 million, 34 million, depending on a couple different sources, but it's almost 62% of our entire state footprint. So obviously a huge part of what makes Idaho, Idaho. And then what was, I think, did I miss anything else, Jack?
And who's managing?
Oh, thank you. So on the federal side, we basically have two separate entities that manage that land. So we have the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, and then we have the U.S. Forest Service. And so they also have different charges and different types of land that they typically manage. And me growing up in the north central Idaho, we mostly interacted with the Forest Service. And so that type of management style and staffing and mission can vary based off of the land. And also we have like wilderness areas, right? So I think generally when we talk about public lands, that can include national forests, designated wilderness areas, and national parks. But I think as part of what I'm bringing into this conversation, it's really kind of all-encompassing, but the land that's most at risk are kind of those, the national forests. It's harder. Each different type of land designation has different hoops that folks have to jump through to eventually transfer or sell those lands.
Great, perfect. Appreciate that. So Brad, next question for you. I'll just paraphrase here, but it's been said that the current public lands debate is the present-day sagebrush rebellion, as you'll remember from the late 70s to the early 80s, as a backlash to federally controlled lands. So what's different now, and how do we get to this point with the potential of public lands becoming privatized?
That's a good question. I have opinions and theories, Jack. I don't know that I have all the answers, but I'd say if you look back at what caused the sagebrush rebellion, which I think is true today, is that there are different reasons people get upset with the idea of public land. Some of it is philosophical. So I think and I have rebuttals for all these arguments, Jack, just to be really clear, but I will try and articulate them as best I know here. So I think there are philosophical issues that some people have with the idea of whether or not the federal government has a legal right to own public lands. I think most of the issues you see around federal public lands today really come from trust and disagreement with the way in which they are managed. The great blessing and the great curse of public lands are supposed to be all things to all people. You got to manage for resource extraction, whether that's cattle grazing, logging, mining, recreation, wildlife habitat, endangered species habitat. It's a complex web of requirements for federal land managers that they have to abide by legally. And then you add on top of that cultural expectations about, we all have ideas of our own worldview, whatever that might be, and we all have things that we'd like to see, the way in which we'd like to see public lands managed. I have a worldview, you all out there have a worldview. Sometimes they overlap and sometimes they might differ. I might want to set aside a chunk of ground for winter wildlife habitat and not see any activity, resource extraction activity in that chunk of ground. Somebody else might say, well, I disagree with you. Great thing about public lands is at least you can have an argument and debate about it, and at least you have a vote, right? Which differs, we don't have to get into it right now, but it differs from state managed land. So at the core, Jack, I think it comes down to trust. Trust that the federal land managers are managing a land that is in the interest of the American people, and trust that the land is being managed in a way that is being managed for all of the different uses that public lands are supposed to be managed for.
Great, appreciate it. So back in August, the state of Utah petitioned directly to the nation's high court asking justices to declare it unconstitutional for the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, to hold on to public lands in Utah without a formal designation. Utah argues that BLM cannot indefinitely, quote, hold unappropriated, end quote, land, and those lands need to be transferred to the individual states. Could the panel elaborate on that lawsuit and identify where it stands today? Meryl, let's start with you.
Yeah, so when we start looking at that particular one, we start talking about, and I think maybe the terminology that they use, unappropriated lands. So when we start thinking about unappropriated lands, it kind of gives us a feeling, oh, maybe those lands are not that significant. They're just unappropriated lands. But when we look at unappropriated lands, those are the lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Those are our grazing lands in the state of Idaho. And when you begin to look at the grazing lands in the state of Idaho, those are the lands that support biodiversity, they support our game populations, they support the flora and fauna that makes Idaho a great place to be. So these are really significant lands for the state of Idaho. And we need to make sure that we understand that. Now, where that is right now, I don't believe the Supreme Court is even going to hear it. And that's a good sign. I think that's an important one. Maybe when we look at what might motivate that, and so I think we have to look back historically, and there are maybe two things. One was the commons. When we look at the commons, that was to take and run. That was the force behind it. And then you can look at a different one, and that is that we have obligations and responsibilities towards others, which requires action. And if we look at any relationship, any partnership, any alliance, or even a society, the absence of that, we will fail. And so when we look at our public lands, especially unappropriated lands, there's always been that little contention, but we have a choice of the path that we want to pursue, and the path is to maintain those as public lands.
Thanks. Alexis.
Yeah, it was pretty disheartening as an Idahoan to see our Attorney General sign on to that lawsuit for a lot of different reasons. But I think what's fascinating is they're really, like I mentioned earlier, it's part of our Constitution. It's our agreement with the federal government. So there actually is not a legal mechanism to transfer these lands from the federal government to the state. So that was, I think, Utah's attempt to create that mechanism. And we've seen other states attempt to do just that. Even just last week, there's some wrangling happening in our state house on a particular federal management parcel. They're trying to do that as well. So that was Utah's attempt to create that mechanism. Obviously, our Attorney General signed on to that. It did get dismissed by the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, on January 10th. But I mean, there's been a huge campaign in Utah by their governor spending millions of dollars trying to change the public opinion about stewardship and management, and that there's mismanagement of these national public lands. So it's deeply concerning in seeing how there's some interest from our Idaho leaders to take stock and note of those investments and messaging. And so anyway, it's hard to believe that they would not continue to pursue creating a mechanism to do that if it's legal, which is somewhat doubtful at this point.
Right. Brad?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about whether or not that's a legal argument, about whether or not we can have public lands. That's been settled for, I don't know, over 100 years now. So, but that's not the point of the lawsuit, right? So the point wasn't to, I don't think anybody had any hope who's on the other side of this issue that they would actually win that lawsuit. The one thing, so the last time this issue really reared its head was around 2015, Malheur Wildlife Refuge takeover, if anybody in the room remembers that time. And the issue went away for a number of years, and now it's back again. And I think astutely so, the people that want to privatize public lands, one of the things that they understood from the last go around is they lost the court of public opinion on the issue. And so if I were in charge of trying to privatize public lands, I would be doing the same thing they're doing today, Jack. So I would be thinking of ways that I can try and frame the issue. I would be spending taxpayer dollars on a PR campaign to demonize public lands, which is what they're doing in Utah. Gutsy move, by the way, to take taxpayer dollars and use it on a PR campaign to convince the people that you should give up what you rightfully own. But so what the whole point of the lawsuit is to try and reframe the debate away from an issue that's about privatization of public lands, which is what this issue is about, and towards an issue that's about like who is a better land manager, the states versus the feds, which is not what the issue is about, but which that is the way in which they want the public to perceive this issue, not as one about that will ultimately lead to the privatization of public lands, which I can get into now, or if you want to save that one, we can save that one.
It's great. So this idea that Idaho should control public lands managed by the BLM is not new, right? This is a reoccurring topic. It's come up with some Idahoans advocating for a transfer to federal land to state management, while others emphasize the importance of federal protection and public access. So I have a two-part question for the panel, one conceptual and one practical. Conceptually speaking, should public lands in Idaho be managed or controlled by Idaho or by the federal government? Proponents see this as a states' rights issue, and after all, this is land within Idaho's boundaries. Shouldn't Idahoans, through their elected representatives, control the land? And wouldn't it be better, after all, for local government to have authority of the lands that they live closest to? Let's start with you, Brad.
Yeah, I think that we should and we do have control over public lands today. That is quite literally what your local land managers, who they are accountable to. Let me frame this up a little bit here. So the state of Idaho cannot today, nor in the future, afford to manage public land. I mean, we're quite literally one wildfire away from bankrupting the state. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us as a state, we're not allowed to run a deficit. So when you can't afford to pay your mortgage, you start looking around at the furniture, or you have to sell your house. What are you gonna do? So in that situation, Jack, we would be forced, it's not an if, it's a how much question, land that you have to sell to pay for a catastrophic event, particularly like the fire season that we had last year. So I think what we can all agree on is that people in this state should have a say on what happens on public land, which we do now. But the beauty of public lands is also that I have a say on public lands outside of the state, because I recreate a lot outside of the state of Idaho on public land. And so we can, disagree perhaps as a society about how much the people close to that land, how much decision power they should have over public land versus people from, a few hundred miles away. But the beauty of it is we all do get a vote in the public land system. So I'll cut it there. I'll try and keep it short.
Great. Lexa?
Yeah, I think Brad hit all the good points, but I think what I would like to share is, there's precedent for lots of these types of nuances in other sectors of our country, right? There's instances where the federal government or our armed services, right, they all have, stations or, departments, right, that are located within those states. Like, that's a relationship and a continuous balance of living in a society, right, and having a federal government and a state government. And I think, we have, like Brad was alluding to, is we have, a good neighbor authority agreement where we can and do work with the state managers, with the federal government. And I think there's oftentimes, room for improvement as things change and shift, but that doesn't mean that we should all just dispose of it, right, and sell it off. Like, that's throwing out the baby with the bathwater does not make sense, especially when we consider what privatization would actually do. It would mean that you would no longer have a partner to collaborate with to manage and improve those lands, not to mention access or grazing, right? So all of those other rights that we get to enjoy, despite the nuances of the uses, would cease to exist if we couldn't find a better way to manage those lands together.
Yeah. Thanks. Mayor?
So, there's sort of this idea to create the perception that management of the lands has not been that great. But I would just like to back up a little bit in history. And I just read this past year that they're going to put 3 wildlife underpasses under Highway 30 close to Montpelier, Idaho. There's a mule deer population there. They call it, I think, the Bear Lake Plateau mule deer population. Approximately 20,000 head of mule deer is what they're thinking about. So in our history, my family's history, that's where we immigrated to the United States. And my grandfather was born in 1891. He began to ride the range at age 16. He rode the range on the Bear Lake Plateau up to Star Valley, Wyoming, where that herd of deer winter and summer. And so there was a cooperative effort to make sure those deer could move back and forth across Highway 30. But my grandfather, after riding the range all that time, every day, he was 35 years old when he saw his first mule deer. 35 years old. My father was 14 years old. I was 16 years old when I saw my first elk. We spent all our time in the wild. So I think the cooperative management that we've seen take place has put us in the position we are today. Sometimes we like to think of the good old days, but what I can tell you from personal experience, for wildlife diversity and abundance, we are in the good old days. And that's due to the cooperative management that's taking place. Not a very good argument to make.
Thanks, Merrill. So I'd like to just play this out a little further from the practical sense, right? I mean, we've heard these arguments and we keep talking about the shift. So what does it look like if next week full control shifts from the federal government to the state government? What Idaho agencies or departments actually manage it? And lastly, and Brad, you touched on this, can the state afford it, right? So Merrill, why don't you start this time?
Wow. What would it look like? You know, I don't know if, I guess we're kind of in a time of chaos right now. And I think that would just be elevated. You know, number one, you've got to have the human resource to do it. You've got to have the financial resource to do it. You've got to have all those things in place. And to put those in place is not some easy task. And again, just as has been mentioned, you know, when we talk about just the cost to manage these lands, we talked about we're one fire away from bankruptcy. I just don't think it's possible. There is cooperation, but to put that for the state of Idaho to begin to manage 62% of the land mass in Idaho, and when we look at funding for education, different things like that, where's this funding going to come from? What are we going to do? What's it going to look like? We have something that's working now. Doesn't mean that we can't make improvements. But to break that down and try to rebuild it again, I'm not sure works.
Alexis.
Yeah, I think there's another piece that I missed on the last question that I want to emphasize, that even though these lands are within our borders, they are not state lands.
No.
They do not belong to the state. And I think special interests are trying to exploit that sense of, oh, it's right here, it must be ours as Idahoans, and exploiting that kind of lack of understanding of the legal piece, and exploiting this is complicated, it's not being managed well, and those tensions that arise from folks that live approximately closer to those places. And I think just, especially from a rural perspective here, coming from, my folks still live in Idaho County, it would be, and we're already seeing the impacts of some of the firings of staff at the Forest Service and BLM and others, that these are folks that have good paying jobs, especially in rural communities, that hold those communities together. And it will be tremendously devastating to those communities if we were to sell off these lands and cease to be able to manage it from a federal perspective. I mean, I can say in my little town, like the biggest employer, which we can have, that's a whole other conversation, like job creation and all of that, but is the school and the Forest Service. So we're talking about, completely yanking what little foundation of economic resiliency we have in this state outside of the Treasure Valley would be completely disrupted.
Yeah. Brad?
I think it would be a night and day difference in the way that lands are managed. The state has a constitutional mandate to manage for maximum revenue generation to the shareholders of those land, which is the, so let me back up. When state of Idaho was founded, about 4 million acres were given to the state to help pay for the expenses of the state. That includes like colleges, education, hospitals, and basic functioning of the state. And the mandate in our Constitution says you have to make as much money as you can off those lands. That's not a dig against the state at all. that is what is in the Constitution, and they do their job, right? That's very, very different than public land, right? They're not multiple use. State lands are not multiple use lands. There's no public process. You don't get a vote in what happens. They're not trying to manage for recreation opportunities. And again, not a dig against the state. That's just not what they're constitutionally mandated to do, right? So the federal agencies, the public land management agencies, they are required to manage for things like providing camping opportunities, fishing, hunting, grazing, mining, all of those other uses, Jack. So it would be, I would say, a catastrophic shift in the way things are managed, and we would all lose a vote. You would no longer have a voice in what happens to those lands. And again, I think that, not to overstate it, to me it's not a question of whether or not they would be privatized, it's just a matter of how much and how soon. Mm-hmm. That's really what would be the question if they were turned over to the state.
Well, and I just want to add one more point too. Just this, we're in the throes of the last few weeks of our legislative session, and Dustin Miller, our Idaho Department of Lands director, has said the legislature has not even allocated enough money to prevent against and pay for what we perceive to be the cost for state wildfire land expenses. They said 40 million, there you go. And we just spent 48.5 million just this last season, just on state lands alone, versus $500 million on federal lands. So we're not even preparing for the cost that is real for our state lands at this moment. So, it's even more ghastly when you kind of look at it that way too.
Right. Thank you.
Maybe just one thing to add to that. When we're talking about state lands and the difference between how state lands are managed, the goals behind it, and our public lands. One of the things that I think is really important, we talk about public lands. Well, yes, they're public lands. They're your lands. They're my lands. And so when we look at that difference of management, I think that's really, really critical. And then what can be done with those lands? So if we just look a little south of us, there is a state that was given sort of like the state of Idaho. And today in that state, there are 2,014 acres of state lands, and they generate a whopping $5,000 a year for education in that state. So what happens if things like that happen? It impoverishes the state, it impoverishes the people, it takes the very values that we all enjoy and appreciate away.
Thanks, Merrill. That's great. Just real quick, I'd like to remind our radio listeners that you're listening to the City Club of Boise Forum, the fate of Idaho's public lands, and we appreciate you all tuning in. Merrill, I'm curious. I've heard a lot of comments about this. As a rancher, what's the impact to your industry? How does this look if they, number one, were to become state controlled? And then secondly, what about BLM lands becoming privatized? Are they similar impacts? Are they drastically different? Can you elaborate on that, please?
Wow. Well, so when we began to talk about, again, I'm going to focus mostly on the unappropriated lands because those are the lands that I think are most under attack. And those are our range lands. So when we look at rural communities, you can have non-basic and basic industries. Non-basic kind of circulates the money within a region. Basic industries, such as ranching, actually export and bring money back into those areas. So when we look at ranching in rural communities, there's a deal called the multiplier effect. And so for every dollar that a ranch brings in to a rural community, an additional $1.05 is created of economic activity within that community. So it has a multiplier effect of 2.05. The next closest one brings in 27 cents. So it has a multiplier of 1.27. So the most intense multiplier economically in our rural communities is ranching. Now, when you look at ranching, and when we look at rangelands, we have public rangelands and we have private rangelands. And both of those play a really critical role in our economy, not only locally, but as a state as a whole. And so when we look at the BLM lands or unappropriated lands, they take up a huge amount of space in comparison to private lands. In our county, approximately 7% of the land is private land. The other 93% are public lands. But the private lands provide the place, and you have to have space and place for wildlife and everything to work. The same with the ranch. You have to have place and you have to have space. And if you don't have those two, you're not going to be successful.
Great, thanks. So Brad, I'm curious from your position as a private business owner in the outdoor industry space, what kind of effect do you suppose this could have on your business or others in the industry, maybe that are in outfitting, hunting, recreation, and such?
Great question. I mean, hunting happens on, I'll just focus on hunting. So most of our customers are hunters, although we do have a lot of just general outdoor enthusiasts. I mean, I hunt on public land, I hunt on private land. I was just down in Texas last week, which is very different than Idaho, in case you weren't aware. Hunting on some private land down there. But you know, the thing that I learned in Texas is it's kind of like picking from a menu when you're out hunting, as opposed to like going out and exploring the wilderness, which is what I love about the American West. People buy our product. I mean, we make a product, Jack, but really what we're selling is an idea. We're selling adventure. We're selling an idea of getting outside, and the gear is just a vessel to do that, right? And I sell all over the world. We sell a lot of product in Australia, New Zealand. Most of our customers are not in the West. They are in the Midwest and the East, and they come out West to have like a big adventure, right? So that's what I mean when I say we're selling an idea for the most part. If you didn't have access to vast amounts of land, so it would fundamentally change hunting in across the country as we know it today. I don't know. It would be speculative of me to say like exactly what would happen to our business. I have no doubt it would fundamentally change what we do. It would change our customer base because people wouldn't have the same opportunities. It would cost more to go hunting. And so what I would guess is that, you know, we would absolutely not have the same, I would not have the same business that I have today, Jack. Can I just say though that like to me this issue is if I lost this in my entire company, lost all my money in the company, that would be very unfortunate. But this issue to me is about much more than money. This is personal. This is my lifestyle. This is why I'm here. This is why I continue to choose to have my company here. There are other states who have very much tried to actively recruit me to move to their state. But we stay here, our employees are here because of what we have here, because it is special. So yes, I just felt like I need to say that, like, yes, there is an economic argument to be made here, but this is also very, very personal.
Right.
And I think it's a cultural issue for those of us who choose to live here.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's take a different turn. It's pretty clear, audience members, if you don't gather, we have some pro-public lands advocates up here. And so I want to turn the tables just a little bit and take the devil's advocate turn for a second. And Brad, you offered, so I'm going to start with you. And I'm just going to say, I recently read from a couple of outfitters that are hunting outfitters right off the bat, involved with the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association, that they are pro-state land because they feel like they are not getting the service that they deserve from our federal land agencies, and they would like to have some control go to the state. So they, again, this whole idea of localizing it so you know who's the managers, right? So let's talk a little bit about the other side, Brad, and maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, specifically, I don't know who these individuals are, and what I would say, I'll say a couple things, Jack. One is that I'm not so sure under a state land model that outfitting isn't going to pay the bills, frankly. So if it comes down to outfitting, again, the state's mandate is maximum revenue generation, and outfitting is most likely not going to be the way in which the state would generate the most revenue. So more than likely, what I would say to those individuals is enjoy it while you have it, because if it turns over to the state, they're not really going to care. Again, I'm not pointing fingers here. I'm just like speaking honestly. Like, the amount of money that you generate by outfitting in this area isn't going to pay the bills. I think anybody who can generate more money, and if your use of that area competes with them, you're out. What I do understand and empathize with is the frustrations that people have with the way that perhaps public land is managed. But and I don't think that'll ever go away, Jack. Like, we're always going to have frustrations. But the beauty of public land is at least you get a voice, at least you get a vote. I have had my frustrations with land managers, and if there are any in the room today, you probably. We may have had words about the way public lands are managed. I apologize for that. But that is the beauty of public land system. So I guess I'm not playing the devil's advocate role very, very well here.
Right. So Merrill, I'll look at you. I mean, let's be honest. There are ranchers. There's got to be ranchers out there who would say, you know what, Merrill, I'd love an opportunity to buy my allotment and own it all for myself, and then I don't have to worry about how many pairs I have out there. It's my land, and I can take care of it.
Yeah, that's sort of like when pigs fly, basically. And the reason for that is, so we have a ranch, and we have about 4,800 acres of private land. We run on somewhere between 35,000 and 40-some thousand acres of public land. Do you think we could afford that? No. And so, yeah, I mean, if pigs flew, we would probably say maybe that would be a good deal, but it just isn't in the realm of thought.
So you feel fellow ranchers feel the same as you in terms of that viewpoint?
Well, I think there's some that sort of feel like, and well, we had the mallard deer and different things like that, yeah, these are our, quote, our lands. And because we have a grazing permit or something like that on it. But that's just not the case. I think for the most part, ranching has evolved where we do appreciate the opportunity that we have to run cattle on public lands. And we have a responsibility to make sure that we do that in a very, very good way, that not only provides a living for us or a lifestyle, but also provides the resource necessary for wildlife. And so I know there are some, but I think it's a pretty small group.
Great, thanks. So I want to circle back to finances for a minute, because no matter what the hot topic is, right, finances emerge. It's been estimated that if we were to sell sell BLM lands, just focusing right now on Bureau of Land Management lands that would be transferred over to states, we could probably generate about $1 trillion, right, for the federal government. And all that could go down to help pay off this growing national debt that we're aware of. So what's the economic value to the panelists? What's the economic value for keeping the structure in place as we have it today versus generating the revenue towards our national debt? Alexis, I'll start with you.
Well, I would say that, I mean, we've talked about this, like it's a culture, right? It's also, I mean, our lands are priceless. Once they're gone forever, right? And I think that would then prevent us from doing other things that could generate revenue. I also feel like this idea of, looking at our federal lands as cash cows is very short-sighted, because, I think, and then there's been some things that have been floated around, like what could we do, right? Affordable housing, or this thing, right, or that thing. And I mean, at the same breath, folks within our, administration are cutting huge programs that provide economic benefit to the federal government and to the states that have those federal lands there. So I think we would not just, of course there's that sticker price that they would generate, but you're also talking about a loss of economic benefit from states like Idaho, as well as the federal government. There's tremendous value that comes from visiting a national park, right? There's tremendous economic value in all of the different aspects that we call as public lands, right? So I think like they're just looking at it without the full picture and seeing the full, oh wow, this would benefit us from this way, but we would actually lose out in all of these other ways. And I think the challenge too is we, on the ground, it's hard to figure out all of those different numbers, right? So it's kind of easy to exploit and just say, oh, we would benefit in this way without actually doing all of the homework to know what actually we would lose outside of just the priceless piece of public lands.
Brad?
I mean, there's lots of ways to make money, Jack. I mean, it comes down to values, right? It's like, I have no doubt that if this is just about money, you could sell your kids if you really wanted to, pay off your debt, right? Like, I mean, what are your values though, right? So,
where do I get in on that?
yeah, there are days, right? So to me, it's like, at what expense?
Yeah.
Like, okay, we sell off all public land, and now we're Texas. Like, congratulations, everybody. It's
or
like
England.
We're like, is that really what we want to be? Is that where we want to be as a state? I sure hope not. And I think that I don't care what your political beliefs are. I think everybody understands the value of being able to take your family camping, right, in the summertime, or going fishing, going hunting, whatever it is you like to do. Everybody enjoys access and enjoys the outdoors, and you really can't put a price on those things, in my opinion. So the national debt's, it's a real issue, right? It has to be addressed. Is selling public lands the way, is that worth it to get to them? Like, not where I come from, no. Right. And I imagine most people understand that.
Right.
So a little bit of what I think about is I think about the difference between instant gratification and deferred gratification. And so we could say, hey, let's sell them. We get whatever that sum of money was, but then they're gone. And so I would simply ask a question: why do we live in the state of Idaho? What attracts businesses to the state of Idaho? what allows us to maintain and recruit talent to the state of Idaho. And I think it is that we have access to public lands. There's, you know, I don't care where you live in the state of Idaho. I don't care how big the city is, how small it is. I think within less than an hour, you can be on public lands. And you can find that space and place that kind of resets your clock from time to time. And so, do we want instant gratification, or do we want to maintain deferred gratification? Do we want to keep something of value, or simply sell it? Like kids, by the way.
So, great question. Another great question from the audience, by the way. What prevents privatization under federal management versus state management? Couldn't the federal government, I mean, just come in, and couldn't BLM just say, hey, look, Merrill's a great guy, we'll sell him at $500 an acre, 20,000 acres? Yeah, good.
There are laws that allow for small scale disposal of public lands today, and it does happen around the country. But it's I don't know how wonky we want to get here, but particularly with BLM, Bureau of Land Management lands, like there are clauses that allow for small scale disposal. Congress has to approve anything larger. I've been out of the game for a while in public land, so I apologize. But anything above a certain threshold has to be approved by Congress. So no, the answer is no. They cannot just go, if Merrill comes up and says he wants 20,000 acres, he's a nice guy, he can make a convincing argument, but the answer would be no at 20,000 acres. And there has to be a public process to dispose of that. State land, again, like you don't get a vote. Their mandate by the Constitution is quite clear. If they feel, the state feels as though the land board feels like this is the way in which we are going to generate the most money by selling it to Merrill, there is no public process like there would have to be on public land. They just decide to do it. It's done. Merrill takes the land, and everybody's happy.
Got it.
Except for the people who lost access. They're not happy.
Right.
Merrill's happy.
Right. Great. Appreciate that. So I'm real quick here. Want to jump back to that Utah lawsuit, and the outcome is that they didn't get the Supreme Court ruling that they or opportunity that they wanted, but Utah's governor has specifically stated that, quote, the court's order does not say anything about the merits of Utah's important constitutional arguments or prevent Utah from filing its suit in federal district, quote, federal district, end quote. So I'm curious from the panel's viewpoint, why does the state of Utah spend reportedly $20 million on a advertising campaign that went along with this? What's the rationale behind all that? Brad, maybe I'll start with you.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot of money to be made, right? Like the state of Utah has a very sophisticated development arm. They do everything from like planned communities, oil and gas leasing, and so they understand astutely so that they are in a very good position with the cash position they have as a state to capitalize on the sale of public land. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, but they lost, right? So
Yeah.
You spend $20 million, like there clearly had to be something else behind the scenes in terms of, what they're spending these dollars on.
Well, again, like the decision maker in this case is really not the courts. I don't think they expected the courts to make a decision. Congress has the authority to change the game, right? So they're playing the long game here. So the PR game, the lawsuit, and they spent money, advertising in podcasts, Washington Post, all, they're spending a lot of money in DC advertising to members of Congress. Well, why would you do that? Because members of Congress actually can make a decision that would change the way the public management system as we know it today exists. So that's the point of this, right? You're trying to change the court of public opinion, change people's minds that reframe the issue in a way that is friendly to your cause, like I said earlier. So instead of it being about privatization, it's try and frame it as an issue that's about states' rights. That's not what it's about, but that's what they want people to see it as such, right?
Right.
Because that's a winning argument in a state like Utah. That's a winning argument in a lot of Western states.
Right. Alexis?
Well, I think, we've seen it. There's been a lot of, I think, even a City Club forum on the shifting political landscape and the impact that outside money has had on our politics here in Idaho. And we're seeing that on display in places like Utah. There's a lot of money to be made by selling off public lands and then drilling or whatever it is that those owners then want to do with those lands, right? And it's relatively easy and simple and straightforward to buy elections to do just that. So I think that's what, obviously Utah has been up to, and, we can see, inklings of that here in Idaho. So I think it'll be really important for, folks like us and everyone else in Idaho to just not take the bait that this is when they say mismanagement or transfer, it means sell off. Like that is what that means.
Right. Meryl?
So I'm going to take just a little different look at this. I think the idea is to create perceptions, and perceptions are really, really powerful. And so I'd just maybe give an example. So probably I think if you look in world history of the natural or environmental disasters that occurred, the Dust Bowl ranks, I think, number 3. And what created the Dust Bowl? Well, there was a perception that was put out that rain follows the plow. And so if you go out and you plow the fields, you pick the rocks, you dig the ditches, you plant, you will reap the benefits of this. And that was put out over and over and over again until people bought into it. And when you look at the photos or that rush to the land, and you think, wow, perceptions are really powerful. But facts can change perceptions if we simply put them out. And that's the deal.
Appreciate that. So we're narrowing down. Got one final question, and we're going to have to move along. We just have a few minutes. So I really wanted to give each of you panelists an opportunity for one takeaway for our audience on the radio and here in the room. And so what is that one takeaway that you want to leave the audience on the fate of Idaho's public lands? Lexus, start with you.
Yeah, sure. I see some familiar faces, but I think I saw some of you at our public lands rally on Saturday. And thanks. It was a tremendous success. We had, just shy of what we think is, 2,000 folks from all across the state. Folks came with their horses from Driggs, people from Moscow, Lewiston. I brought my 2 horses down there. And so we saw, hunters, anglers, rafters, recreationalists, folks from all, political stripes, user types, all standing in unison saying, this is not for sale. And so I think that, if we can continue to share the truth about, what's going on, the benefit that public lands offers us as Idahoans, we will continue to safeguard those lands. But I think what we will run into is if we just assume or stay quiet, that's when we're actually really at risk. And I think I mentioned this in one of my opening points, is we've had a ton of folks move here that don't know the history. And I think it's really important for us to get out there, right, to recreate, to use these lands, but also to explain the history and what this means and why this is synonymous with the culture and heritage of being in Idaho, and it's at stake. So I think folks realize that, given how many folks showed up on Saturday, and we're really heartened by that momentum and want to keep pushing forward.
Great, thanks. Brad?
Yeah, pretty simple. Transferring public lands to a state is just about privatization of public lands, lost access, and complete catastrophic change in our way of life as Idahoans, plain and simple.
Thanks, Brad. Meryl?
So my thought is, we have inherited a treasure that has not come at any easy cost. We have it. And our actions will determine whether or not we can pass this treasure to our children, our grandchildren, and future generations.
Thanks, Meryl. Thank you, panelists. We hope you all enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to seeing you all at the next City Club Forum. I believe it's Medicaid Reform in Idaho on Tuesday, April 8th. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.